How's it going, everybody? Greg here, Gregarious Media, here with another year-end list video, the top 10 disappointing albums of 2018. Now, I say disappointing and not the worst because these albums were actually ones that I was anticipating to listen to and just ended up being underwhelmed by. A couple of these albums, the further down we go on this list, do eventually get bad, to a couple of them being the worst albums that I've heard all year. But I didn't really go out of my way to listen to a lot of albums that I knew I was going to dislike. I mean, there was Drake and Nicki Minaj, but that was because of other circumstances surrounding the albums that got curiosity to get the better of me, and I really regret listening to both of those. But really, these 10 I selected were albums that, you know, they had a couple singles, or these are bands that I really enjoyed, or artists that were coming up that I really sort of wanted to hear what they would do in a full-fledged project, etc., etc. The details that I'll get more into with each individual album that I go over. But just overall, I ended up being underwhelmed. And again, these are disappointing, not in the sense that they're all bad. In fact, the first couple of albums I'd say are decent on this list, but the further we go, the more bad they get. And I will express my frustrations accordingly. So without further ado, let's kick off this list at number 10 with Bullet for My Valentine's Gravity. They're one of my favorite metal bands. I admit it. I still enjoy them. I've been listening to them since high school, and I've frequently returned to their first two albums, being The Poison and Scream Aim Fire, being my favorite. And this is actually a band that I did a prototype of Discog Devil on earlier in 2018. So if you want to get sort of my idea of what I thought of their first 5 albums, that video's in my channel. But overall, I would say that the second half of their discography has sort of been trying to be overly angsty, trying to sound a little bit too teenage diary-esque lyrics. Temper Temper, I still think, is their worst album, because it didn't really have a lot of redeeming value, where it sounded like phoned-in rehashes of Fever with bad mixing. But Gravity, at the very least, I can say, attempts to switch up Bullet's formula a bit, but not with the best of execution. This album kind of comes off more as an identity crisis. This is where they try to infuse sort of the electronic rock and kind of metal of today's radio rock scene, in which I know that Matt said in interviews that he wasn't exactly as inspired in today's scene of metal, and while I think he made too general of a statement there, and I think he's wrong in sort of the overall broader picture, I can sort of see why he would want to switch things up in the songwriting. But they made a mistake on this album, just like Metallica did, again, and which I'll go into in a little bit here. Actually, I'll go into it right now. I cited Temper Temper as doing the same mistake as Injustice for All, where the production was just really, really weak, and there was hardly any bass in the mix whatsoever. And when you heard the bass, it was incredibly muddy as shit. So here on Gravity, they made the mistake that Saint Anger did, and this time it wasn't in the production. If anything, Gravity is overproduced at times on actually the majority of this album. But what they ended up doing was not having any solos on this album, which was at least something that Temper Temper did have, and which, while I consider those solos phoned in, they were at least the best part of that album. On here, there are no solo sections, which makes it really, really annoying to listen and sit through some of these songs, because a lot of these songs don't have nearly the personality of other Bullet albums. It sort of ends up coming off as a Matt solo project that may have been decent, but with a Bullet for My Valentine name, it comes off as amateurish in a lot of instances. I mean, there are some songs that I have come to enjoy and return to from time to time, like the single Piece of Me, the Gravity title track, I think, had a really cool anthemic feel to it. The Don't Need You single is easily one of the highlights off this entire project, even though it's almost a year older than the album itself. And the closing ballad, Breathing Underwater, on the standard version, which I wasn't expecting to be nearly as good as it was. The lyrics are definitely very simplistic, but I think Matt's vocal performance on there definitely sells it. So those particular songs are where the sort of electronic stadium rock tinged portions of the songwriting, I think, work. But really a lot of these come off as more amateurish and just really not lively at all. And what's worse, I think, about this album is on the deluxe version, in which I rarely ever listen to the deluxe versions, but I knew that there was a heavier song called Crawling, which completely outshines the entire standard disc, and that is a problem. I think if they went more in the style of Crawling, and maybe with a little bit of electronic inflections like the other songs I mentioned, I think this album probably would have been good. I'm not sure if it would have been, better than Fever, for example, but I think at the very least it would have given them still their identity while exploring these things. But the main issue with this album is that it just doesn't have that Bullet feel. It's just very bland and generic in a lot of areas. So hopefully if Bullet follows this album up, and I say if because Matt has been kind of very odd with sort of in interviews saying that he didn't want to be in this band almost during the time of the recording of this album. So if they follow this up, I hope that if they do decide to continue this electronically tinged sound, that they at least experiment within their sort of better moments in their sound. But, I mean, we can only hope, I guess. At number 9, we got Light the Torch with Revival. Now, Howard Jones is one of my favorite metal vocalists of the 2000s in his time of Killswitch Engage, being some of my favorite albums of that decade. And when he came out with the new project, The Devil You Know, which was essentially a supergroup with members from All Shall Perish, Devolved, Bleeding Through, I mean, the two albums under the name were pretty decent with a lot of great moments. So I was sort of anticipating, they kept building the sound up and had really great highlights. So I thought, okay, maybe they'll finally release an album that has these really heavy qualities and Howard's great vocals, and it will be a classic. I was really anticipating for it to be good, but essentially the albums, though, overall, while they did have those great highlights, did kind of sound like metalcore by the numbers, but Howard's vocals were still the selling point. And essentially this whole analysis sort of applies to their renaming of Light the Torch. They got a new drummer for this project because I guess the old drummer had the rights to the Devil You Know name. I don't know all the legality around it, but this album approached more melodically, more clean singing, and which with Howard is perfectly fine because I love both his clean and his screams. But the problem is the instrumentals on here are just by the numbers again, in this more melodic, hard rock focused metalcore group. That again, Howard is the selling point, but the instrumentals on here are so lacking in personality outside of the singles and the song Sound of Violence, where they finally get extremely heavy with Howard screaming his ass off. I mean, with the songs like Die Alone and Calm Before the Storm, I was pretty intrigued by this sound because it was more melodic, more straightforward, but it sounded pretty solid overall. And then the entire album comes out, and it just sounds like standard melodic hard rock that may have done well maybe in the late 2000s, early 2010s, but in 2018, this is nothing new. And I was pretty disappointed in this album. I mean, I've gone back to a few other songs off this project, but I've never been able to just go through a whole listen of this album without being bored. But while this album is titled Revival, I will say this, it's not nearly as disappointing as the revival that Eminem had in 2017. So, I mean, take that for what it's worth, being completely different genres and artists. But this album, I think, is at the very least decent. If you're a real hardcore fan of Howard Jones, I think you might be able to get through this album without much problem. And I consider myself a pretty more than casual fan of Howard Jones, but I can't really just sit through this album for a full track list just because it just doesn't have nearly the personality that I know Howard has been on other projects. At number 8, we got Phresher with PH, and I've actually never listened to any of the singles that Phresher had before. The only reason that I actually went to this album was because of Phresher's verses on Eminem's Chloroseptic, more so the remix, where he had an actual verse. The energy that he was bringing on that track was so fucking fantastic, and on Stevie Stone and JL's Groomed by the Block, he also had this really fantastic energy. So I was interested to sort of see where he would go on a debut, because he definitely had that banger energy that really, he stood out with his voice. Unfortunately, once I discovered that he actually did release a debut, and the only reason I knew was because I found it on Spotify, I realized that he was lowered to the same standards as just modern trap trends. Okay beats, okay lyrics, a couple of great sparks like the Like Dis remix with Busta Rhymes, and Beast Mode with Joey Badass and Fetty, who Fetty's verse I couldn't really give a shit about, but I mean, Beast Mode was a really fucking solid song. But ultimately, a lot of these songs were not that memorable. Most songs end up just kind of blending into the background along with a lot of other trap songs I've heard this year. And I really hope that Phresher does come out with more than this, because I think this album just, there was a bit of a hindrance to his vocal ability. Because I don't care, because Phresher doesn't have any like bad lyrics, or at least not that I remember from this album. So I'm not really worried about lyrics when listening to him. He just has that energy that I know that he can bring, and I don't care if, he has a few songs here and there that sort of tone down the energy, but Phresher definitely has this vocal inflection that just is like a modern version of DMX. He could really bring out like the absolute monster in this sort of genre, and I really hope that he sort of hones in with this potential that he has. But this album just is not it. At number 7, we got G Herbo with Swervo, another rapper who I've kind of been on the fence with. I've enjoyed a lot of songs by G Herbo back in his Little Herb days, but full albums I've usually found to be okay or good at best. I've never found really any great albums overall. He had great moments, but I've kind of been on the fence with G Herbo for a while. So when I saw this album, again, I just happened to find it on Spotify, especially with the album art that's paying homage to, clearly referencing Eric B. and Rakim, I was kind of intrigued to see what was new with this album. And spoiler alert, it's not that much. I don't really have a lot to say on this album, except that the production from Southside is pretty good for the most part. A bit one note at points. G Herbo is slightly offbeat with some of his flows, which can get kind of grating depending on the song. But it's just another album where there are topics that he's just gone over and over and over again. And he's just not saying it in anything new or in any new or interesting ways. So, again, I don't really have a problem with G Herbo. I was just kind of hoping, especially with the sort of album art that it was homaging, that, this album would be really, really solid. And, can't judge a book by its cover, I guess. Sort of applies. You can't judge the album art, or you can't judge the album by its album art. Like, oh, this album art is fucking great, so the album's gonna be great. Unfortunately, no. So, the production on here was pretty solid, though. So, if you're looking for some really cool, dark, sort of trap-style production, I would give this album a listen. But if you're looking for, great rapping, unfortunately, I don't think Herbo brought his A game on this album. At number 6, we got Disturbed with Evolution, and do not judge me, I still enjoy a couple of Disturbed's albums. They're a band that I've listened to since middle school. I still enjoy Indestructible as an album all the way through. Disturbed aren't a band that I just go back to casually, but if I hear a few songs on the radio or something, if I have the radio on, I'm not going to turn it off. I still enjoy Disturbed from time to time. My nostalgia can get the better of me. But I heard that they were coming out with a new album, and especially off the success of their cover of Sound of Silence, that, they have an album titled Evolution. And Disturbed has been criticized time and time again for not changing up their sound. So I was a little bit curious to see, if they actually evolved their sound with this album. Then I got a little bit nervous when I was reading interviews that David Draymond claimed that this would be their Black Album. Obviously, Black Album referring to Metallica Black Album being one of the most, if not the most successful metal album of all time. So I got a little bit nervous because that was trying to be a bit overhyping. And as predicted, the end result was a bit lackluster. The singles were easily the best off this album, though. A good amount of the rock songs are pretty much in Disturbed's standard wheelhouse. I mean, Are You Ready, as the first single, wasn't too bad. It had a nice industrial tinge that I think gave the song enough of a personality to really stand out. You also had the ballad single, Reason to Fight, which I actually kind of enjoyed, and the other rock single from here, which I actually put on my Spotify list. Unfortunately, I'm forgetting the name right now as I'm recording this, and I didn't put it on my notes here. But to sum it up, this album, for a standard version of 10 tracks, has 4 acoustic ballads, 2 of which were okay, and 2 were being really boring as fuck. And the other rock songs outside of the singles from here were really nothing new in Disturbed's catalog. I think the production on here was fine enough, but, I mean, this album was really nothing new in terms of what Disturbed has done. I mean, I know that they wanted to sort of cash in on the Sound of Silence success, and I am, I guess, glad in a way that they did present an album with a different variety in sound, and just, unfortunately, the execution was not there. The cohesiveness is definitely not there, and unlike Bullet from a Valentine's Gravity, there isn't a bonus track that really outweighs any of the songs on the standard version. So, yeah, I guess I'll just stick with Disturbed's sort of older albums for nostalgia. I don't really care for this new album at all. And at number 5, we got Gorillaz' The Now Now. Now, this album does not have the quantity issue that Humans did, and that made my disappointing albums list last year. And no song on here strikes me as bad, but it wasn't really good. This album's just here. It exists. And that's really it. This is mellow, has some funk and indie-tronica-driven tracks, sort of along the lines of a Plastic Beach, but I don't think nearly as interesting. And it's just not nearly as memorable. The instrumental track on here is the one that I enjoyed the most. And, I mean, I like the single Trans, but, I mean, really, that's it. It's more cohesive than Humans, but it's far less experimental, making this album maybe only slightly more enjoyable than Humans as a whole. But I definitely have not returned to this album since making this list, and I don't foresee myself really coming back to this. If I ever do a Discog Devil episode on Gorillaz, this is definitely going to be low on the list. I'm not sure. It's just slightly better than Humans, but for only the fact that it's more cohesive and far less of a quantity issue. At number 4, the most unexpected album to be released this year for me was Parliament with Medicaid Fraud Dog. This is the first album in 38 years under the Parliament name, one of the most legendary funk groups in history. So I was already interested. This album was in collaboration with George's son, Tracy Lewis. 23 tracks, an hour and 46 minutes long, inconsistent as fuck. The middle section has some of the better tracks on here, one of which has a Scarface feature that I really enjoyed. But a lot of this album jumps from, decent quirky funk that we know Parliament for, to weird bastardization fusions of modern trap that sound way out of place, and cuts that really could have been edited way shorter. I mean, again, this is 23 tracks, an hour and 46 minutes long. I'm not sure if they looked at what Migos were doing or what Drake was doing and was like, whoa, look at all those tracks. We should do the same thing. Yeah, the quality on here is definitely not that. This is definitely not nearly as good as classic Parliament. It's an odd listen with some decent tracks, but I really question why this album exists. I mean, 38 years, and this is the album that you decide to put under the Parliament name? This is... No. For the bronze disappointment, we have A$AP Rocky with Testing. This album is boring. It's absolutely boring. A follow-up to what I would consider Rocky's best album, this is easily his worst. And that's the weird thing. I mean, while at long last A$AP definitely had its problems of sort of being over-bloated, it definitely still had a lot of interesting qualities that I could listen to pretty much the majority of it front to back. And his presentation on there still had a lot of energy and charisma. Where on Testing, he doesn't even sound like he wants to be on his own song. Questionable features like Kodak Black easily being the fucking worst of them. A lot of weak production, and really, I mean, A$AP Rocky isn't the most lyrical MC by any means, but really this album is just void of anything interesting in that front. I see no reason to return to this album. This is more skeletal than at long last A$AP, and it's not as bloated, but there really isn't anything that I can find redeemable on this album. It's another album that just exists. Outside of a couple tracks like Distorted Records and Praise the Lord, I don't care for any of the other songs on this album. And at number 2, for the silver, oof, I might get a lot of shit for this one. NASIR. And I enjoyed this on initial listen, but progressively found more and more to dislike. This was the 4th release out of the 5 good music summer releases, and this was arguably the most hyped of all the projects, especially since Nas already had a track with DJ Khaled saying, Nas album done. So, this is, Nas is finally coming back with a new album. And this album was fucking dismal. This was easily the most disappointing hip-hop release of the entire year. And there's this argument I've always seen, and I kind of agree with to an extent, that Nas has had bad production before, but he always has good bars. And this is a claim that Nas even acknowledges himself, pretty much saying that people come to me for the bars. So what's the excuse here then? Because really, Kanye steals the show. Kanye's production on here is pretty good, although I'd say it's easily the weakest of the 5 projects. It still, I think, steals the show, even if I guess there was this controversy that he stole 1 or 2 of the songs in the album art too. I never really follow that as much, but essentially, Kanye's verse on Cop Shot the Kid I think was great, and the track Everything finally has Nas doing a very, very solid verse. I think Kanye's vocal contribution there wasn't really necessary, but I mean, those 2 tracks in particular are solid. But that's really it. I mean, you have a lot of filler on a 7-song project. That's not good. I mean, most of the features were just terribly. I mean, the other features, I should say, outside of those two songs, were just incorporated horribly. You had Puff Daddy shouting distortedly over this very dark, ominous beat, and then 070 Shake. I think her vocal contribution was okay at best. I think she did a lot better on Ghost Town off Kanye's Yay album. And Nas is spinning easily some of his most forgettable verses on here. There is no reason to return to this project and say, oh yeah, Nas is back. Like, what the fuck is this project, honestly? It's 7 songs of mostly filler. Now this is what I would see the argument of, this is a bad EP. This is like throwaway sessions that I think Mike Seatown, described this probably best in the Dead End Hip Hop review, where, this was 80% Kanye, 20% Nas. And that Nas sounded like he was just doing a job. He came in, did his thing, got the paycheck, left. There wasn't really a lot of effort on Nas's part on this album, and I think that's the most disappointing part. Was that, especially Nas being, the god-tier lyricist that he is, has the classic Illmatic, and you could argue It Was Written is also a classic, and he has great, solid albums in his discography, despite some production problems. Now you have an album that pretty much production-wise is some of the most consistent and good that Nas has had in a while. So what the fuck is the issue here? It's Nas. But, surprisingly, there was one album that was more disappointing than this. And I would say if I did a worst albums of 2018 list, this would have made it on there. And at number 1 for the gold of disappointment, we have Machine Head's Catharsis. This is easily one of the worst albums Machine Head has ever recorded, and I'm not sure if it's the worst in their discography, considering the new metal era was pretty bad, but this is pretty fucking close. The instruments on here were stale, despite the album kind of having some more groove and melodic focuses. I know that Rob said that this wasn't going to be the heaviest album that they've done. It was going to be focusing on other elements, and that's fine. It's not the worst offense. Rob's vocals aren't as strong on here for some reason, but that's not really the worst of it. It's the lyrics. The lyrics on here are the absolute fucking worst thing I have ever heard from a metal album this year. And I mean, God. This sounds like Rob reading off woke Tumblr posts. Like, California Bleeding, Triple Beam, Bastards, they are noteworthy for how awful the lyrics are. And I know Rob was trying to be political. I mean, who the fuck isn't trying to be political since Trump's election? But, like, he's done political before, and he's done it so much better. So this album is just a fucking awful excuse in Machine Head's discography. It's 74 minutes, spread over 15 tracks, and only a couple of songs are decent at best. The title track, Kaleidoscope, I actually enjoyed. Volatile, I only liked because it sounded like a decent Slipknot song. But yeah, a lot of these songs are just fucking awful. And on the note of Bastards, this just sounds like it should have been a Dropkick Murphys song. It would have gone over so much better as a Dropkick Murphys song, in fact, because the instrumentation was there. All you need to do was throw on some bagpipes and more of the chorus chants, and boom, you would have had a decent Dropkick Murphys song. On here, it just sounds awkward as fuck. It's thrown in there, and Rob basically did this sort of thing better on the song Scandalous from The Blackening. So much better than this. So, whatever Machine Head decides to do after this whole lineup change that's happening, I hope they learn from this album and, release something just a lot better than this. Even the album before this, while it had its flaws, I wouldn't say it's the most interesting of Machine Head's discography, was still at the very least good with great moments. That's kind of at least the standard I would hold them by. And Machine Head have fucking classic albums under their belt with Burn My Eyes and The Blackening and Locust. So what the fuck is this? Ugh. This is the one of the worst albums I've heard all year, but it's easily the most disappointing album I've heard in 2018. So that's going to do it for this year-end list. I did a top 25 best albums of 2018 list that I will put at the end of this video, and also you can find in the description down below. Please go check out my Discog Devil series. I'll be throwing more episodes up throughout the year when I find the time, because those take a lot of time to sort of research and sort of compile. And check out the Spotify list that I made on this video. I found, as I call it, the best tracks of the disappointments of 2018. Just so then, you know, hey, you can find at least something off of these albums that I bitched about for well over 20 minutes, or close to 20 minutes. I don't know, after editing, how long this will be. You know, like, comment, subscribe, all that shit. Standard YouTube stuff. Thank you guys for watching and or listening. And catch you on the next video. Goodbye.